What's going on, everybody? I'm Johnny Brook. Welcome back to another Crafted Workshop video, and welcome to my backyard. So in this two-part video series, I'm going to show you guys how I built this 4x8 lean-to shed. Part one, I'm going to cover building the foundation, framing all the walls, adding the siding, and then finally framing the roof. And then in part two, I'm going to be doing everything else, including adding all the trim, doing the roofing, building these doors, painting, and then finally building this ramp. So this is obviously a pretty big project, but I think it's a very beginner-friendly project. The tools I used on this build, which were all from Hart Tools, who is the sponsor of this series, were all very beginner-friendly. I think it's a great kind of skill builder project, and hopefully these two videos will help you guys build something like this in your yard. So I guess without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with the project. The first step in the shed build was getting the site prepped and the foundation laid. And we had this little area next to our air conditioning units that ended up being pretty much perfect for a shed this size, and I started by staking out the rough footprint of the shed. And to make sure the area I was marking out was square, I pulled diagonal measurements with my tape measure from two of the corners and moved the stake on the opposite end of the footprint until those diagonal measurements matched up. I actually placed these stakes at the exact corner locations of the foundation, but I should have offset them outwards by about 6 inches just to give me a little wiggle room for digging out an area for the 4x6 skids, which the shed will be built on, which I needed to do next. My initial goal when digging was to get the areas level left to right, and I figured I could adjust the front to back level with the gravel that I'd be adding later. And I used the 4x6 skids with a level on top of them to take my readings and just kept removing dirt until I got things nice and level. Once the areas were level, I packed the dirt with a tamper to help keep the foundation from settling too much, and then I started adding gravel. And gravel serves a few purposes here. First, it provides some drainage and keeps the skids from staying in contact with water for long periods of time after rain and that kind of thing. Second, gravel doesn't compress like dirt does, so it makes for a more stable foundation. And last, gravel is much easier to spread and level than dirt, which is what you see me doing here. As I had mentioned, I had planned to level the skids front to back with this gravel, but there was just way too much of a slope to do that with the gravel I had on hand. So instead, I just turned the back skid on its side, and since it's a 4x6, this lowered it by about 1.5 inches. And this ended up making up the difference perfectly, and then I could get the skids level and square to each other in that final position. After double and triple checking the skids for level and square, I could move on to building the floor, starting with the joists. I used 2x6 for the joists, and they were spaced at 16 inches on center, which made for an extremely rigid and sturdy base for this shed. I cut the two rim joists to their 8-foot length at the miter saw, and then I could lay out the floor joist locations on the boards. And if you've never framed a wall before, generally this is the way in which framers lay out their stud and joist locations, by measuring and marking the locations on one board, and then transferring those marks to the other board with the two boards butted up against each other. And this helps to reduce measuring errors, and it's also just a lot quicker than pulling these measurements twice. Another common practice is to mark out where one side of the stud will go and then mark an X on the other side of the line where the stud should be placed. And this again avoids confusion during construction, but it also keeps you from having to mark both sides of each stud location, which saves a lot of time when you've got a lot of walls to frame. Last, I partially drove in 3 3-inch screws in each corner of the rim joist so that I could have both hands free when assembling the floor later. Next, I cut the floor joist to size of the miter saw, making sure they were all as close to the exact same size as possible, and then I could assemble the floor framing. I lined up the first floor joist with the corner of the rim joist, making sure it was in line with the line I had added on the inside face of the rim joist, and then drove in the screws, making any necessary adjustments with a hammer between adding each screw. I repeated this process at the other 3 corners, and unfortunately one of these rim joists had a decent amount of twist to it, so I had to fight it a bit, but eventually I got it assembled, and then I could go back and add all of the inside floor joists using the same method. Once the frame was assembled, I checked for square again by measuring the diagonals, and it was pretty much dead on. Next, I got the floor positioned on the skids, making sure the front rim joist was flush with the front skid, and then I attached the framing to the skids using some metal brackets. You could also just toe screw through the joist into the skids, but these brackets just make it a little easier to lock in the position without things moving around. I added 6 brackets in total, 1 at each corner and 2 at the center of each rim joist, and then I called it a day for day 1. The next day, I got started by getting the 3/4 inch plywood floor panel attached to the framing. I first added some construction adhesive, which I unfortunately ran out of halfway through, so I switched over to using regular wood glue, and then I could drop the plywood onto the framing. I started by attaching 2 of the corners of the plywood, making sure they were flush with the framing, using 2.5-inch screws. Attaching the 3rd corner locks in the squareness of the floor framing, so I made sure it was flush with the edges of the plywood and then added another screw to lock it in. Finally, I added a screw to the 4th corner, and then I could add a bunch more screws along the edges of the plywood to lock it in place. I spaced the screws roughly every 8 inches around the perimeter of the plywood, and then I used a chalk line to mark out the joist locations in the center of the floor, and added screws spaced every foot there. And with that, the floor was built, so next I marked out the locations of the wall bottom plates, again using a chalk line. The inside face of the bottom plates should land 3.5 inches in from the outer edge of the floor, since I used 2x4s for my walls, and having these marks will give me reference points when attaching the walls to the floor later. The next thing to work on was getting the walls framed, and I started with the back wall here. And the back wall was framed exactly like the floor with 16-inch on center spacing, and I once again marked out my stud locations in the same way as on the floor, then cut the studs to length using the miter saw. Before assembly, I crowned the studs, meaning I checked to see which way each stud curved along its edge, and I faced this curve in the same direction on all of the studs. Luckily, these studs were surprisingly straight for construction lumber, so there wasn't really much need for crowning them, but it's good practice when building structures like this. With the studs in place, I could get the wall assembled, and I again used 3-inch screws here, but I only needed 2 screws per connection with these 2x4s. Also, I should mention that I spaced this shed off of my house about 15 inches, and I definitely wouldn't build a structure like this any closer, as assembly got really tricky as things like the roof framing moved closer to the house as the build continued. Once the back wall was assembled, I moved on to the side walls, and I actually built these out of 2x3s rather than 2x4s. And we're going to be storing our trash cans in the shed, and that extra 2 inches of floor space width-wise inside the shed were a necessity if we wanted to fit all 3 of our giant trash cans in comfortably. Instead of buying 2x3s, I actually ripped these down from some 2x8s, which are made of a much sturdier southern yellow pine, and these 2x3s should be plenty strong for this kind of structure. Also, you might notice the stud spacing is a little different on these side walls, and that's so the studs line up with the vertical grooves in the siding panels I'm going to be using later. While I'm building these sidewalls, I want to take a second to talk about the sponsor of this week's video, Hart Tools. Hart Tools is a new line of tools sold exclusively by Walmart, and their main focus is providing a great quality tool at a great value. So as you've seen, I've used nothing but Hart tools on this build, and I've got to say, I think they're perfect for the DIYer or weekend warrior. These tools have got plenty of power for all of your home improvement and DIY projects. They have pretty much every tool you might need in their 20-volt lineup, so you can have everything on the same battery platform, and Hart even has a 40-volt line of lawn and garden tools, including a mower and chainsaw, which you'll see in part 2 of this series. If you want to learn more about all of the Hart tools I used in this video, check out the links in the description below, and again, big thanks to Hart Tools for sponsoring this shed build series. Anyway, once the side walls were framed, I could frame the front wall, which was a little different than the other 2 walls due to the door opening. And whenever you have a door or window opening in a wall like this, you need to add what's called a header, which is basically just a beefed up piece to support the structure above this unsupported opening. In the case of this door opening, the header is just 2 2x4s with a piece of 1/2-inch plywood or OSB sandwiched in between, and this brings the dimensions of the header up to 3.5 inches square, so it matches the rest of the studs. I assembled the header with more 3-inch screws, and then I could mark out the stud locations on the top and bottom plate of the front wall. And the framing is also a little different on walls where there's a header, as you need both a full-length stud right next to the header, called the king stud, as well as a stud that's cut down to support each end of the header, called a jack stud. I made sure to mark out these locations on the top and bottom plates, and I like to mark J and K at these locations to indicate these are where the king and jack studs are located. With that done, I could get the front wall assembled, initially adding the 2 corner studs and the 2 king studs. And it was at this point that I realized I had cut my header too short, as I had cut it to the exact width of the door opening when it needed to be 3 inches wider than the door opening. This wasn't a huge deal, as I was going to be building the doors myself anyway, so rather than remake another header, I just moved the king studs in 1.5 inches on each side and moved along with assembly. Once those were moved in, I could attach the header to the top plate and king studs with more screws, and then I could flip the whole wall around to add the bottom plate. Last, I added the 2 jack studs, which I cut to size after framing the rest of the wall. With that, all 4 walls were framed, so I could move on to getting them attached to the floor. And luckily, I thought ahead here and realized that I would not be able to attach these siding panels to the back wall after getting the walls up. So I first went ahead and added the double top plate to the back wall, which is just another top plate on top of that first top plate, and then I could get the siding panels attached to the back wall. I also went ahead and painted these panels so that I wouldn't have to try to squeeze in and paint the siding later, and then I could finally attach the panels with more 2.5-inch screws. And these panels are offset from the top edge of the wall by 1/2 inch to keep them from interfering with the ceiling rafters, but the panels are flush with the sides of the wall. Also, just like when I added the plywood to the floor framing, adding this first panel to the back wall locks in the squareness of the wall, so I made sure the panel was nice and flush with the edges of the wall before adding that 3rd screw. And then I came back and added more screws around the perimeter and in the center of the back panel to attach it permanently. I then repeated the same process for the second panel, which I evidently applied a heck of a lot more paint to since it's much darker. Also, you might be wondering about the pretty sizable overhang at the bottom of the wall, and I certainly could have cut down these panels a bit, but I figured the shed would look better with more of that floor framing covered up, so I just left these back panels full length. Finally, with those back panels in place, I could start getting the walls stood up, starting with that back wall. And this wall had gotten pretty heavy at this point, but I got it upright and positioned it so that it was in line with my chalk line and flush with the sides of the floor framing. And then I attached it to the floor with more 3-inch screws. I also made sure these screws went into the rim joist below, not just into the plywood. Next, I could get one of the sidewalls added, and I realized that I hadn't accounted for my 2x3 sidewalls when laying out these chalk lines, so I marked another line with my speed square before adding the wall. I again attached it to the floor using 3-inch screws, but I also attached the corners of the 2 walls, making sure they were nice and flush. And since that back wall was already locked in the square, I could ensure that the side wall was also pretty much square by lining it up and attaching it to the back wall. Finally, I repeated the same process for the other side wall and the front wall, making sure all of the corners were aligned before attaching the walls. With the walls up, I could move on to adding the rest of the siding to the walls, and to assist with this, since the walls were now vertical, I marked out locations in line with the bottom edge of the back panels and added a few temporary screws there to help hold the siding in place while I got it attached. Speaking of which, next I could move one of the panels into place and get it attached to one of the side walls, again making sure the edges were aligned to ensure the wall was totally square. I added screws roughly every foot along the edges of the panel, as well as along the grooves in the center panel where there was a stud directly behind it. I repeated the process for the other side of the shed, and then I could go back and add the other double top plates, which I had forgotten to add before the siding. And these double top plates help to further lock the walls together by having the double top plate from the side walls overlap the front wall. And as you can see, I decided to use up some of the 2x4 offcuts for the double top plates on these side walls. The front wall got a full-length double top plate, as I figured it would help strengthen that span above the header, and then I could move back to adding more siding. This siding on the front of the shed required a little bit more effort as it needed to be cut down first, and this siding also needs to end 1 inch from the inside edge of the door opening to leave room for the doors to be added later. After taking some measurements and marking out those reveals, I cut down one of the panels using my circular saw, first marking my lines using a drywall square. I first cut the panel to length to fit the shorter length of the front wall, and then I ripped off a long strip for the area to the left of the door opening, and then a shorter strip for the area above the door opening. With the pieces cut, I got them installed using the same method as before, also making sure the edges matched up with the reveals I had marked around the door opening previously. The piece above the door opening was a little awkward to attach, but luckily my ladder is pretty versatile and I figured out an orientation that let me reach the piece. To finish up the siding install, I repeated the process on the other half of the front of the shed. And now that all the walls were locked in place with the siding, I could cut away the excess bottom plate from the front wall using my reciprocating saw, and this really opened up the opening into the shed. The next structure to work on was the roof framing, which had honestly been intimidating me a bit as I'd never done this kind of framing. And it turned out to be pretty simple once I got my head wrapped around the angles, but I was definitely glad to have some plans with a template for reference here, and I'll link to the plans I used in the video description below. This roof has a 4/12 pitch, which means the roof rises 4 inches for every 12 inches of run, which is measured from the front edge of the roof towards the back of the shed. And this angle works out to 18.5 degrees, which sounds pretty specific, but luckily it's easy to mark out with a speed square by pivoting the square until the 4 on the common pitch scale on the square lines up with the edge of the board. And you could certainly make these cuts with a circular saw, but you're going to get a lot more consistency if you can cut your rafters with a miter saw that's set to match that 4/12 pitch angle. Next, I could lay out my bird's mouth, and the plans also included a template for this, so I could transfer those lines to my rafter and then redraw them with my speed square just to confirm everything. The vertical cut on the bird's mouth, which is called the heel cut, matches that same 18.5 degree angle that was cut on the ends of the rafters, and the horizontal cut, which is called the seat cut, is oriented at 90 degrees to the end of the rafter. And this makes laying out these lines fairly simple with a speed square, and the exact location and depth of your bird's mouth really just depends on the span between your walls. After laying out the location, I could cut the bird's mouth, starting with the circular saw, and since this saw blade is obviously circular, it's not able to reach all the way into the quarter of the bird's mouth, so I needed to come back and finish the cut, which I did with my jigsaw. And I've seen this done a bunch of different ways, including chiseling out the extra material, but a jigsaw worked great here, as long as I set it up so the blade was perfectly square to the base. I repeated the process for the bird's mouth at the other end of the rafter, and then I could test fit the rafter on the shed. The heel cut of the rear bird's mouth needed just a little bit more material cut away so the front bird's mouth would sit flush with the siding, so I did that quickly off camera, but after a little bit of adjustment, I had it fitting really well. With this first rafter dialed in, I could just transfer the bird's mouth locations and length of the rafters to the rest of my rafter boards, and then get them cut with the miter saw, circular saw, and jigsaw. While I was cutting the rafters to length of the miter saw, I also extended the lines I had traced with my speed square so that it would be easier to follow them with the circular saw and jigsaw. I also wised up and clamped the rafters in place while cutting them this time, and this helped a ton. I repeated the process on the 4 remaining rafters, and then I could line them all up to check them against each other, and luckily the rafters looked great. Next, I could mark out the rafter locations on the top plates on the front and back walls, and the rafter spacing here is 24 inches on center. Once again, I marked an X on the side of the line where the rafter should sit to avoid confusion when installing them, just like I did when framing the rest of the shed. I attached the rafters to the top plates by toe-nailing 3-inch screws at each end of the rafter, and I just worked my way from one end of the shed to the other, attaching the rafters as I moved along. The last pieces to add to the roof framing were the sub-fascia boards, which attached to the ends of the rafters. And these are definitely a little awkward to install, but partially driving in the screws first really helped. I used my speed square to make sure the top edge of the sub-fascia was in line with the top of the rafter, and then added 2 screws into each rafter. Adding the sub-fascia to the back end of the rafters was even more awkward since I was so close to the house at this point, but luckily I came up with the idea of adding a few scraps to help keep the sub-fascia in position while I added the screws. And my impact driver just barely fit in this space with my shortest bit, but I eventually got all the screws added and I could call the roof framing done. All right, I think that's where I'm gonna end it for part 1 of this video. Again, in part 2, I'm gonna be covering doing all of the trim work, adding all of the roofing, building these doors, painting the shed, and then finally building this ramp. So hopefully you'll stay tuned for that. Go ahead and ring that notification bell so you don't miss that video. Also, if you wanna learn more about those Hart tools I used on this project, as well as all the materials I used, I'll have links to those down in the video description below. And last, while you're here, why not go ahead and watch another one of my videos that YouTube thinks you'll dig. All right, thanks for watching, everybody, and until next week, happy building.